we did definitely see our margin shrink significantly because prior to that, I was running a 40% margin. It dropped down to virtually nothing for a period of time. And we've gotten it back at this point by, divesting some of that stuff and cutting back. That's not to say you can't push through that and get to something bigger. It's a commitment, though. At some point, you're no longer a property manager. You have to accept that. You are a people manager. Then you should probably try to stay smaller. Most companies are going to have a much bigger margin and better owner earnings than you would if you tried to grow the business to that no man's land area.
Welcome to the episode of Profitable Property Management. Today I'm talking to Todd Ortscheid of PM Assist and Revolution Rental Management. Todd, thanks for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Repeat guest. It's been a little while. Glad to have you back.
Yeah, it's been a couple of years now.
I want to get some of the updates on what you've been up to lately. So catch me up to speed, man. What have you been up to the last couple of years?
Sure. Last, I'd say, year or so, I've probably been focused more on being a vendor as opposed to being a property manager. I still do have my property management company, of course, here in Atlanta. I did kind of sell off parts of it, downsize it, but I've been focusing on being a consultant for the most part, working with property managers on revenue maximization, process implementation with Lead Simple, just general one-on-one consulting. So that has been probably, I would say 80% of my time over the last year is what I've been doing. So yeah, that's kind of the big difference since last time we talked, I guess.
Give me the good, the bad, and the ugly of consulting.
I would say the good is easy. I mean, that's, you always have something different that you're working on. Every company has its own unique issues, its own unique challenges. So, there's not the same thing day after day. You're not just putting out fires at a property management company over and over again. It's always something new. So, it's interesting, it keeps you entertained, I guess. Mm-hmm. The difficulties of it would be that, a lot of people hire a consultant. They know that they need to get something changed. They need to fix some things in their business, but it's very difficult for them to actually pull the trigger on a lot of it. When you tell somebody that, hey, you've got some people in the wrong seats, or your structure isn't right, or you need to implement this software, a lot of times there's a lot of pushback. They don't want to make those changes. Oh, I've had these employees forever. I don't want to upset them. Or, we've had these same processes in place for so long. I don't want to change that. And so there's that friction between, they know that there needs to be changes made, but they're so resistant to the actual change. So it can be frustrating as a consultant to try to get that stuff done. So I would say that's probably the pros and cons to it.
How does that inform your client qualification process and who you choose to work with?
That's a really good question. That's still being refined, I would say. I mean, we've had clients in the past that we will no longer work with because of difficulties. Most property managers just need a little bit of a push, though. They need to know that, hey, other people have done this. Here is how it's worked out. So usually you can get people to kind of come along after some pushing. But yeah, there does need to be some initial vetting to see, if I'm talking to somebody and they're just telling me tons of problems with their business, then I try to be upfront with them on that initial free consulting call and say, hey, I'm probably going to come in here and tell you need to completely overhaul your business. Is that something that you're able to do? And we'll kind of talk about what that might entail and make sure that they're capable of doing that. And if there's too much resistance, I might say, hey, you're not ready for this.
Mm-hmm. I want to hear more about the shift in your awareness around the things that you're talking about now versus when you first started in your career. I actually remember you being an early customer a number of years back and the business looking pretty different. When you think about the specific inspiration that you have around system and process, did you always have that bent and later on you found the tools and the context to do it? Or was it something that you really just didn't quite have the passion show up until maybe the last 5 or so years?
No, I mean, that's encoded in my DNA, I would say. I mean, when for those who are familiar with Culture Index, if you do my Culture Index profile, it calls me a technical expert. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where my natural inclination is towards systems, processes. And then in my prior career, I mean, I was an airline pilot, so everything is checklist, processed, everything's regimented. So that's what I lived for 14 years before I got into this business. So it was kind of a natural thing, but trying to find out how to do that in property management and realizing that you needed to do that in property management. And it wasn't just, because like you said, for the longest time, we were basically a portfolio-based management company. Not a lot of systems and processes because even though that is my natural inclination, I didn't kind of draw that conclusion at the beginning that I needed to implement that in this business like I did in the cockpit. So it took time to get there, I would say.
What other systems and technologies did you try and play around with before you landed on Lead Simple?
Lots of them. So we spent years with Process Street. So I would say we were on that the longest. But I mean, we tried Asana, Trello. What else did we look at? Monday, I think we took a look at. ClickUp. I mean, there's so many that we took a look at. I mean, it's crazy how many options there are, and all of them kind of have pros and cons. Each of them has things that they're good at, things that they're not so good at. But ultimately, and of course, the last one we did was HubSpot right before we were on Lead Simple, which was an enormous investment, but just ultimately didn't work out. I mean, it wasn't what worked well for property management. So that was kind of the thing with Lead Simple, is it was kind of custom tailored for what we needed to do in the property management space.
I'm really curious to hear you say it doesn't work out, because my kind of mental story is that there are a lot of tools that you can make work, right? Like if you're really dedicated, committed, you can kind of figure it out, and you're pretty technical yourself. Like what exactly didn't work out about HubSpot?
My biggest complaint with HubSpot, so I mean, like you say, I mean, it's super powerful. I mean, this is enterprise level software is basically what it is. I mean, it's like a Salesforce or something like that. But the biggest problem with it was it's not so much a process checklist type platform. What it really focuses the most on is it's a marketing platform. It's a sales platform. And it does that fantastically. I mean, there's no doubt it's incredibly good at that. Part of the problem with that, though, is it is so advanced that most people aren't going to be able to use most of those features themselves. They're going to need to have a HubSpot expert on staff or hire that out. But the other thing is, on the process side, it's not that great. So, I mean, on the marketing and everything else, it's fantastic. But when it comes to the simple act of having a checklist with some detailed instructions there that you can follow, that's not really a thing in HubSpot. You can create tasks, but they're kind of disjointed tasks around you've got notifications for them, but they're not in a nice checklist format. So it's not what I would prefer for implementing processes. If you're looking for the best marketing platform you can find, that's probably it. Mm-hmm. But that's not what we really needed.
I want to hear a little bit more about your philosophy on how to build processes. You see people either go really wooden, literal, extremely detailed, or really high level. At some point, it's just being kind of like a glorified checklist. Where do you sit on that nexus, and how much of that is determined on a client by client basis versus like your kind of general ideal state philosophy?
So the way I kind of look at it is you have your checklist, which is very simple. It's basically the task names in Lead Simple, for lack of a better word. It'll say something like draft the lease. That's the checklist item. You click into that, though, and there's detailed instructions on it. So that kind of goes back to how it was when I was at the airlines. You have a checklist. It's like a one-page document that you use for everything you're doing. But then you have a giant book. It's called, an operations manual that has all the details for every single one of those items on your checklist. So that's kind of how I look at it. You need to have the big book that has all the details, but for the most part, people should know how their job works, and they're just using the checklist to make sure that they're getting all the items done. So, that's kind of how I look at building these things out. I think you need both, but, I think what a lot of people run into mistakes on checklist is they'll create a checklist that's way too detailed. It has every little thing you need on the checklist, and that's not what a checklist is. It's not a do list. It's not, a read and accomplish all of this list. It's, you're checking off these items to make sure you did them is really what it is.
You're known for having a perspective that owners should enforce their standards and requirements and requests around using the software. Mm-hmm. If you were looking at it from the opposite vantage point, if you're talking to a team member and trying to enroll them and get them excited, how would you articulate the benefits for them, not just for the owner?
Well, I would say the biggest thing is explaining to them how it makes their job easier. That there's an industry consultant, another one, Mark Cunningham, that I'm sure most of your viewers are familiar with. He frequently quotes a study that was done that said that the number one thing that employees care about in job satisfaction is, I know what my job is. Just understanding what their role is at the company. And that ranks above pay, above benefits, above everything else. That's what people care about, because that just makes their workday easier. So if you can show someone that this is going to make your job more easily definable, you know what your role is day in and day out, all you have to do is work down your task list and you know what you're doing. That's a big benefit to people, I think. When you just throw someone in a position and say, hey, you're managing this portfolio of properties, figure it out. That's stressful. That's difficult. That's a lot of work. But when you give someone a very clearly defined list of these are the tasks you have to do today, that's a stress-free job for the most part. So I think that you can explain to someone how that benefits them. And you can also, if you're so inclined, you can take some of those increased efficiencies and you can roll that into higher compensation, better benefits for your employees too, so they can get some advantages out of that.
How involved should a team member be in the construction and updating of a given process that they're responsible for using day to day?
So that is a common topic of debate that I have with some other people in the industry. I'm not a big fan of these big group discussions on what a process should be. I think most of that should be driven by the owner of the business. They know how they want their business to operate. However, there's a lot of cases where a owner doesn't really know how things are working. If you've gotten to the point in your business where you're 500 or 600 doors or more, you might be detached enough at that point where you don't really know how a lot of these things need to be done anymore because it's been so long since you've personally done them. So in that case, you need to bring people in. You need to find out what's currently being done. What do we need to change? But I always emphasize, do not let your employees dictate how your processes are going to be. Have input, find out what they think, get some guidance maybe, but you need to be in charge of your company. Don't let your employees push you around. I see way too much of that in this industry. And it's not just this industry, it's a small business thing. You never see this from big corporations. When I was at the airlines, nobody calls you in and asks you what you think about how the next process should be. They just hand down a memo or an ops bulletin, as we called it, and that tells you what you're going to be doing from now on. And nobody debates it. You just go about and do your job. It's a small business thing because everyone's afraid, if I lose that employee, that's going to create hell for me for the next 6 months. So they kind of let that employee control what their business is doing. Don't do that. That's not good for your company.
So that's the compliance side of it. What about the feedback loop, though? Your team members will give you constructive, useful feedback. How do you formalize the process of incorporating that feedback to modify the processes over time?
So we actually solicit feedback on a regular basis. We actually have, I can't remember what the form is called off the top of my head since my wife does operations for us now. But we actually have a form. Every Friday we ask people, fill out any information you have for us you think would help us, anything we can improve. So we're constantly asking for that. And we also give them the opportunity to submit that anonymously. So if somebody doesn't want to speak up, then they can submit that anonymous feedback. And that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to do what they suggested, but it at least gives them the opportunity to let us know what they're thinking, anything they're seeing that they think needs to be improved upon. So there's always that opportunity for feedback. I think there needs to be a culture of that. That's sort of an EOS thing. Also, for those who are on that, you want to be collecting that information from your team. But again, decisions, there needs to be somebody in charge. Somebody needs to actually be making those decisions and sometimes telling people, hey, we're not going to be able to do it the way you would like.
What's the half-life of a process in your mind? How long before they need to be updated?
Well, we are constantly updating ours. So, I know some people only like to update things like management agreements once a year. I've never really been of that mindset. If I see a problem, if I think we can improve it, we're going to improve it now. We're constantly doing that. In general, most processes, anytime you're changing anything at all in your business, it means a process could break down. So if I bring in a new software, if I've changed from one inspection software to another, for example, that kind of has a cascading effect that can change a lot of processes. Mm-hmm. So even the slightest change can cause you have to make changes in those things. I think one of the biggest problems we have that I see frequently is employees will just start working around the process because the process hasn't been updated. Mm. So, the employee will realize, hey, something's changed here. So I'm just going to start doing what I need to do to make it work to this new change. And they never pass that information up the line so the process can get fixed. So 2 or 3 years goes by, and before you know it, the process is there, and it's maybe 20% of it is still useful, and the rest of it, everybody's just doing their own thing that they know they need to do. So there does need to be a frequent review of these things to say, hey, what do we need to do to make sure this stays on track?
I experience that from time to time, the gap between what's actually between my conception of how we do that and how it's actually being done, and just realizing that The bigger the organization gets, the greater the delta can be from the owner's conception of what's being done versus what's actually happening on the ground. Documentation is a great way to sync up and close that gap. Could you walk me through your full tech stack right now?
No, because I can't remember all of it off the top of my head. It's basically a full page of our P&L is all of our software. The major components I would say would be Propertyware. That's our accounting software. Lead Simple, of course. We use RentCheck for inspections. Zapier obviously is a big part of our automation process. JotForm for form submissions. Parser for parsing emails. So I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff. The major components that people need. I always tell people you need your accounting software, you need your process software, you need something for forms, something for e-signatures, and you need Zapier. Those are kind of your basics you need to have to be able to automate your systems and all that kind of stuff. From there, it's endless. I mean, there are literally something like 10 or 20,000 apps that will connect to Zapier that you can automate things with. So your tech stack can keep growing. And that I know a lot of people will look at that and say, wow, you spend a lot of money on software, which is true, but I spend a lot less money on labor also.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of, we're doing a lot better overall, even though the software expenses are higher, the labor expenses are lower.
You're spending $1 to offset $4.
Exactly.
And who do you use for your e-sig platform?
We use PandaDoc, which we think far away is the best platform to integrate with Zapier.
What are some actual use cases where you get leverage there?
Everything. I mean, we use it for leases, management agreements. With some clients, we use it to just do letters that get sent out. You can use it for sales documents because we also do brokerage a little bit in our business. We don't do a lot of it, but we do some. So anytime you're doing a contract or a letter, you can use PandaDoc. So, the big benefit that I always tell people about PandaDoc is you can embed metadata in the background, basically, that you can use to connect documents back to Lead Simple. So you can automate a whole lot of stuff. That's not so easy with some other e-signature platforms. So I always kind of encourage people to go the PandaDoc route. But there's huge efficiencies in getting your e-signatures out of your accounting software, putting them into a dedicated e-signature platform that you can connect through Zapier. I mean, there's a lot that can be gained there.
I think that's probably counterintuitive for some folks, though. For a lot of folks, it's like, well, the point is that it's embedded in my property accounting software.
Yeah, that is probably the biggest mindset shift that I think people need to have is this idea that their property management accounting software should be a bunch of other things also. Your property management accounting software should be your accounting software.
And really good at accounting.
Yes. Actually, you should have no problems with accounting. But beyond that, it's going to be, subpar and everything else because that's not what those companies do. When I talk to some of the people at some of these accounting software companies and they're trying to build e-signature or inspections or whatever the case may be, they're the first to tell you, we're going to make something that's going to work. It'll do the basics of what it needs to do, but that's not our business. We're not in the DocuSign or PandaDoc business. We're in the accounting software business.
Yeah, this was like amenities.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is something that's, hey, it's helping you out. If you run a small property management business and you're not going to have all these other softwares, then we'll enable it so you can do it. But that's never going to be their specialty, so it's never going to be the best. And I'm a firm believer in take best in class, connect it all together, because that's possible nowadays with most of these softwares, and do that instead of trying to make the fifth best solution that's built into your software, trying to force your processes to work with that. Don't do that. Use best in class.
We just talked about this in a webinar when we were announcing the rollout of our Propertyware integration, but I just want to ask you again. You're like deep in tech. Like you, in my mind, are like the guy that would figure out 50 different options to change, and you haven't. Why?
So, there was a period of time, I think, where there was sort of a neglect of the software where it was, not being kept up to date. I mean, AppFolio, if you look at that, they have been constantly making improvements over the past few years. I mean, they were the first one, I think, that you guys had the integration with. And Propertyware wasn't really doing that, or RealPage wasn't doing that with Propertyware. More recently, that's kind of changed. They're starting to get back into the role of, starting to add features. They now have the new API that you guys are going to be connecting to. So I think there is more of a move there to start improving Propertyware again. But, my biggest thing is, it's the most customizable software out there. And for me, it's so easy, all the custom fields, all the reports, all the data I can get out of it, that I can own my data instead of having it locked away inside someone else's software. That's very important to me.
Which is interesting to me because you were getting that benefit for a long period of time in a way that wasn't even like fully supported, right? Like you found a way to get your data. That's probably the delta between your experience and others, is that you were technical enough to find a way to do what you wanted to do, even though the retail experience probably isn't like that for everybody.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's not like, out of the box, it's so easy to do this. I mean, the capability is there, but you kind of have to know how to get the stuff out that you need. So, I mean, we would basically pull all that data out, put it into something like Airtable or Google Sheets, and then we could do whatever we wanted with it. That was our data that we could use in whatever way we needed. But it wasn't easy. I basically had to hire a software developer to do a lot of that. To be honest with you, I was lucky. I found a remote team member in, I believe it's Pakistan, if I remember right. And I was paying him, I think, $8 an hour or something like that. And he was living like a king. He was the happiest guy on earth. I mean, that's a lot of money in Pakistan. So, it was great for him. It was great for us. We were able to get that work done that we needed to do. But you're right. I mean, that's not something that the average property manager is probably going to do. When you have something like Lead Simple that's pulling the data out automatically, where it's really easy for you to just click a couple buttons and suddenly your data is now available to you. That's a completely different experience.
And I think in general, this is an adjacency to one conversation I find very interesting, which is frequently folks will meet power users. I'm thinking about somebody like yourself, think like Ben Sensenbach. I can think of a bunch of other folks. And it's not always obvious from a distance the delta that exists between what you're able to build or what somebody like Ben was able to build and all the effort then went into it versus what I'm able to build. Which isn't to say that I can't build something great, but I may not be extremely technical. I may not experience like joy and euphoria at building apps, etc. When you frame expectations for folks, particularly somebody that's coming in hot saying, I want to automate everything, Todd, I want one red button I press monthly that runs my business. How do you frame and hold expectations for what's realistic and practical and how long it's going to take to get there?
Well, I mean, usually what I'll do is I'll explain it in terms of hours of labor that's going to go into this. So, I'll tell somebody, hey, if you want to automate, so like when we build out someone's processes at PM Assist, it's 12 major processes is what we're doing for the life cycle of property management. And I'll typically tell somebody, if you're an average user learning how to do this, this is probably going to take you somewhere between 400 and 600 hours to figure this out and get this done. So think about how many weeks, 400 to 600 hours of full-time work factors in. And that's why, because you'll hear people say, oh, it's taken me 3 or 4 years to build out my processes. Well, that's why you're working 50 hours a week in your property management business, and then you're trying to do a few hours a week of building your processes and automating this stuff and learning it as you go along. Just try to think of how long it takes if you only have a couple hours here or there to do that. It's an enormous commitment. So, I always try to explain it in those terms of hours of labor this is going to take. But there's also just an element of technical know-how. So, some people are just not geared towards sitting in front of a computer and going through processes for hours at a time. If you're a sales-minded person, which a lot of real estate agents who get into property management are, this is not your skill set, man. You're not going to enjoy doing this. It's introvert work is what it is, so this is not a salesperson. So you need to know that about yourself and realize I'm going to have to find somebody else to do this, whether I bring it in-house. Some people bring in somebody who's good at that work or hire it out to a consultant. You're going to have to do something else because you're just going to have to recognize your skill set. That's one of the most important things about being a business owner is knowing what your skill set is and what it's not.
I feel both empathy and tension when you described several hundred hours of work to get it up. On the one hand, I think it's amazing to me how people will relate to a platform like Lead Simple and they'll look at the cost and think like, well, that's what I'm paying. No, what you're paying is your time. What you're paying the vendor is the lesser output. The real input is your time and your effort and your thought cycles, Some folks are like, so why am I doing this again? Like if it's that much effort, like what is the yield? How would you articulate the yield that is commensurate to justify that level of labor investment on the front side?
So, it's what I always say is, so imagine that it takes 20 hours to build this one process, but then think about how much you're automating out of that And that is perpetual. So it takes me 20 hours to build this
Once.
one time. But then from now on, from here to eternity, theoretically, this is how many hours a week I save as a result of this. And then it usually compounds to being thousands upon thousands upon thousands of hours. Or it could be factored into labor reduction where, it's not your work that's being reduced, it's an employee's. But as a result, instead of having to have 2 employees, I only have to have 1 for that role. So, you can figure it in as labor savings. So, that's kind of how I would look at it. It is frustrating at the front end to get it put together. It's a lot of work, but the payoff is extreme in a lot of cases.
Now, I assume that you are dog fooding and taking your own medicine here. You mentioned that 80% of your time is happening at PM Assist, but the remainder of the time is presumably going to the management company, which is still active. How would you frame what it's done for your own shop?
Well, it basically makes it to where the only things that I have to be involved in are escalations. So for the most part, the team is able to handle everything on a day-to-day basis. A lot of people who are viewing this might remember I went on a road trip a couple years ago during COVID. I got bored and just decided I'm going to drive around the country. Because I had set all this stuff up, at that time it was still in Process Street instead of Lead Simple, but because we had it all built out, I didn't really need to do much. I basically started my day every day. I flipped open my computer. I did 30 minutes or an hour worth of work. That's all I had to have involvement in the property management company. And then I could go off and drive around and look at waterfalls and ocean and that kind of stuff. It was nice. So, it's given me that sort of freedom from the business. So I can still have the business. I still get the benefits of having a property management company that produces profits, but I don't have to do much with it. It's basically just when there's a really unusual problem that the staff doesn't have a process for, that they have to come to me. Otherwise, it kind of runs itself.
And when the staff does come to you for things, do you then take that as input to figure out more processes you can build?
Generally. So, we will do, we have a knowledge base on our website. We have owner knowledge base, tenant knowledge base. So if there's a question that comes up that we don't have something there for, we'll build it. So, we'll create a new knowledge base article. If there's something that comes up that we don't have a process for, I'll create a new process for it. The goal is eliminating anything that comes to me, finding what was the reason that this had to come to me. Let's plug that hole, because I want it to be at the point where I never am needed in the business. That's the ultimate goal. Now, obviously that's aspirational. That's not really realistic. There's always going to be something. Crazy things happen all the time. I on the other call we talked about, we talked about a murder that happened in one of our properties. You can't have a procedure for that. That's just, a once in a lifetime thing. So those sorts of things will happen, but, from a practical standpoint, you can get it down to being such a rare occurrence that, you could be like a Peter Lohman, for example, who takes 2 months off during the summer and just disappears to Europe. That's not an unrealistic thing. You can do that.
I think of Brandon Skolden, who just did that recently as well. I never think of a small business as being an annuity in the same way that a T-bill or a CD would be. And even rentals aren't that, right? Like there's some ongoing effort. However, what you're describing is a lot closer to an annuity to be able to collect the cash flow, low effort. And the upside, part of the upside that I see there is a different emotional relationship with the business versus an emotional relationship that says, like, on occasion, I'm just going to have a bad day because the level of proximity that I have and what's going to be thrown up on my plate, it makes the vibe of holding the business feel differently. We've seen this wave of acquisitions that have taken place. Do you think that somebody who goes through this process is any more immune or durable or less likely to sell?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's a whole lot of people out there who decide to exit because it is stressful. They're trying to eliminate the stress. They're trying to eliminate the work. If they had another way to do that wasn't exiting their business, I think a lot of people would. And there's good reason for it because, the valuations we get on property management companies, they're up a lot. 10 years ago when we went to NARPM conferences and you heard what people would pay for property management companies, we're up a lot from that now, but it's still not like any other business. If you sold a software company, a restaurant, whatever it may be, you're going to get a far better multiple than you get off of a property management company. It's just the nature of the business. So I still don't think people get a good return on exiting their company. You're usually far better off to find a way to hold on to that business. Like you say, treat it as an annuity, as a cash cow, basically, where it's just constantly churning out money for you that you can have as a basically passive investment for the most part. And, you basically have a perpetual revenue stream there. Why do I want to sell it off and get this one-time cash infusion instead of having this ongoing cash cow?
Now, it's interesting in your seat that you're pairing the revenue conversation with the automation conversation, and that together combined is what feels like it gets much closer to this idea of annuity. When you think about trends in the industry, where things are headed, what's on your horizon? What comes to mind for you of like notable trends in the industry right now?
Well, I would say one of the biggest trends right now is, aside from acquisitions, I would say would be regulatory risk. So we're getting a lot of risk from the federal government at this point, talking about limiting what we're able to do on the revenue side. There's a lot going on as far as fair housing considerations. There's just a lot more that the government at the federal level is trying to get involved in. Now, how successful they will be at that, I have, opinions on that and what they're able to do, but they're certainly making an effort to try to make our life more difficult. So, I mean, that is a big thing, I think, right now in the industry. The other trend I'm seeing is it's starting to feel a lot more like circa 2012, 2013, as far as the leads that are coming in. Leasing also. It's no longer the super landlords market that it was from the leasing perspective. Days on market are up. But we also have a lot more people that are looking to rent out their houses. So we're getting a lot more leads in than we were over the last few years, to be honest with you, from accidental landlords. So, I mean, for the last few years, a lot of it has been investor focused. If you're a business like mine that was always very much accidental landlord based, I don't like working with big companies. So, I don't want to work with REITs. I don't want to work with institutional players. So that has been a lot of the business the last few years. If you wanted to grow your portfolio, you had to take on people who had chunks of houses rather than one-offs. So that's kind of shifting again, because we have, as I saw this morning on CNBC, we've officially hit an 8% average interest rate on a 30-year mortgage. There's people are holding on to their houses now. They're not going to sell that house that has a 2.75% interest rate. They're going to keep it as a rental. So we're seeing that trend again, where, back in when I was first getting into the business, it wasn't that hard to get new owners. And I think we're going to see a lot of that, in the next few years because of how things have changed on the sales side.
How has your strategy and ambition shifted over time? I remember a period of time where you were focused on increasing and growing. You just mentioned some divestiture of a part of your portfolio more recently. What has the transition looked like and what's driven that?
So I am a firm believer that the average property management company is better off not trying to be a big dog. I think what most property management companies do is they grow beyond a certain point, usually 400 or 500 doors. They hit that point and they try to push beyond that. And what happens is their profit margin shrinks as they do that, because they start adding layers of middle management, which is an inevitability. You can't avoid it as the business grows. You can't manage everything. So you have to add additional people. Those people are expensive, so your margin shrinks. Then people get frustrated, they stop growing, but then they're now stuck at, say, 800 doors. Their margin went from 40% down to 10%, and they're kind of in this no man's land that isn't very good. So I think a lot of people get into that. And
did you experience some of that dynamic yourself?
Yeah, to a certain extent. Yeah, we were at our peak, we were at about 600 doors of single family and 500 or 600 doors of HOA. And we did definitely see our margin shrink significantly, because prior to that, I was running a 40% margin. It dropped down to virtually nothing for a period of time. And we've gotten it back at this point by, divesting some of that stuff and cutting back. That's not to say you can't push through that and get to something bigger, and make it successful. It's a commitment, though. And you have to, Evernest, they have a podcast where they talk about this all the time, where Matt will always talk about at some point, you're no longer a property manager. You have to accept that. You are a people manager, a business manager. You no longer have to be an expert in what it takes to lease a house. You need to be an expert in, how do I manage a team? How do I deal with HR issues? How do I deal with risk management? That's what your life becomes. So if that sounds intriguing to you, then by all means, try to grow to thousands of doors. If you have no appeal whatsoever for that, then you should probably try to stay smaller. Most companies are going to have a much bigger margin and better owner earnings than you would if you tried to grow the business to that no man's land area.
Talk to me a little bit about your team culture ethos. One thing I've heard you have some commentary on is the idea of Hire slow, fire fast. Walk me through how you handle underperformance.
Yeah, so I am a firm believer that no one should ever be surprised when they lose their job.
Agree.
That should be something that they see coming, that they've been counseled about several times. And when it happens, they're like, yep, you're right. I knew it was coming. And I think when I hear people say, hire slow, fire fast, I think there's a tendency away from that. They just make a knee-jerk reaction. And that might not be what some people mean by it, because I've had this conversation with Matt Tringali, and he uses that phrase, but when we talk about it, he's more along my lines. It's just we use different terminology. But I think when some people hear that, they think at the first notice they have of someone underperforming, it's time to cut them loose. And I don't think that anybody should be doing that. I think instead what you should be doing is counseling them, training them, saying, hey, let's see if we can figure out what the issue is here. In a lot of cases, you just got the person in the wrong seat. You might have someone who's very good at sales, but you've got them in a customer service role, and they're just never going to excel at that. And you need to figure out what the issue is. And if you move them to the right seat, they could be your best performer in your company. So, the other thing I always remind people of is if you have someone who's underperforming, that's your fault. You hired wrong, or you managed wrong.
You onboarded them, you trained them.
They didn't bring themselves into your company. You made this decision. So you need to figure out, hey, what did I screw up here? If somebody's doing bad, what do I need to do to make sure why is this happening? In a lot of cases, what it is people aren't doing personality testing. And I'm a big believer in that when you're on the hiring side of things. There's, I'm not sure if you've read this book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Danny Kahneman.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful book. It covers a million different things, but one of the things it covers is hiring. And I discussed this with pretty much all of our consulting clients. He was, before he was a Nobel Prize winning psychologist, he was basically in charge of recruiting and hiring for the Israeli Defense Forces. And he thought he was the best person on earth for putting people into the right role. And he just had this perception that he had this natural inclination to put people where they belonged and would best perform. But then after a number of years, he did an actual study on this and figured out, of all the people I've placed over the years in the IDF, how many of them were successful, how many of them had to be moved. He looked at all the data, and what he found was he was basically no better than a coin flip. And he is literally a Nobel Prize winning psychologist. He should be better at this than anybody on earth. And he can't do better than 50-50. So if you think you can, with all of your other stuff going on, just using a gut reaction to figure out who's going to be good at what, I'm here to tell you, you're not. You're never going to be. You need to use data to figure this out. So I'm a huge believer in culture index. There's other things out there like predictive index, even a basic disc profile. If you're a small company and you can't afford, something big like culture index, just run people through disc, figure out what their strengths and weaknesses are. And too many companies don't do that. I hear a lot of people talk about this, 8-hour grind of a hiring process where they're trying to wear people down. And what they're really doing is just trying to figure out, what's my gut reaction to this person? Are they going to do well in this role or not? I'm going to decide. Mm-hmm. And no, you're not going to figure that out. It doesn't matter what kind of process you put them through, unless you're actually testing them at some objective level. It's not going to work.
Hiring is really tough.
Yes.
My experience is that it's very easy to underinvest in hiring. And where I've landed on the amount of effort required to hire well is a little shocking relative to where I was at. Early on in my career, it was exactly what you said. It's like probably for a given role early on, might have 10 to 15 applicants, talk to 3 of them, hire 1 of them. Now the volume is much higher, and there's a greater degree of conviction in our organization on who exactly we're looking for, and more willingness to hold to our standards, as opposed to, I heard one of our hiring managers one time say, well, if we don't hire this person, I don't know who we're going to get. I was like, well, that's the beginning of the end, That's a scarcity mindset of like, this is the only option. So yeah, I know it's not a fit. And the reality is that it's not fair to that person. In the moment, the delusion is like, well, we'll give them a shot. That's not actually charitable to say, I don't really know if this person's qualified, but we'll see. That's not, you put somebody in the seat that you think is going to succeed, position them for success. I'm a big believer in that idea that there should be no sense of surprise when people depart. And ideally, that conversation is kind of linearly amping up over time so that when it happens at the very end, it's mutually understood. It could be, it is still painful, honestly.
Oh, yeah.
It's never an enjoyable conversation, but it does require leaning into conflict. And I want to talk a little bit with you about conflict avoidance. As an entrepreneur, there was a point in my career where I realized that parts of me can be somewhat conflict avoidant. I almost found that a little emasculating. I think of myself as like more, and my disc profile is like high D, etc. But realizing there are parts of me that are like want to avoid difficult conversations. How about you? How do you relate to conflict in general? And what is your leadership style kind of grown and changed over time when it comes to dealing with conflict in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, some people are surprised because, I mean, if you look at, my Facebook posts and that kind of stuff, people think, oh, he lives in conflict. He's happy with that. Not really. I mean, I enjoy debate, particularly political, philosophical debate. That kind of conflict I'm cool with. When it comes to something like terminating someone's employment, though, that's like a gut-wrenching thing for me. That's very, very difficult. That's the kind of conflict and confrontation that I do not handle well, because I do have in the back of my mind that, oh, I hired this person. They probably left another job, and we're small enough where I usually know my employees, so I'll know, well, they just bought a house and they've got 2 kids, but at the same time, you have to make the change for the good of the business and everybody else that's there. So it's really difficult. So I don't actually deal very well with that kind of conflict. That's probably a function. If you look at my culture index or my disc or anything, you can see my social ability is, dead nothing. I mean, I force myself to be able to do these sorts of things like a podcast or a presentation, but that's not my natural inclination. So that's probably part of that. But I have leaned heavily on another consultant in the industry, Deb Newell, who helps me with those things. So if I have to do something like, terminate someone's employment, discipline them, counsel them, I will go to Deb for advice because she's fantastic at that sort of thing. So, that's something I tell a lot of people is, you got to have kind of a group of people that you go to for different things, because there's no one consultant or, one mentor who's going to be able to help you with everything. There's always, I'm great at building processes and policies and operations. That's my thing. I know that that's my strength. I'm not good with conflicts with people. I'm not good at managing people. I'm not good with sales. So you have to know what those things are and know the people you can go to who are expert at that to help you with those things. So that's kind of how I deal with it.
I experience you as somebody that does not do well being hard sold something.
Yeah.
And I experience you as somebody that has like a deep guttural response to the feeling or the idea of being bullied, even including in a corporate context, which like you would think that wouldn't happen, but on occasion it does come up in a business setting. Where does that like gut reaction come from for you? Were there any like early formative experiences that inform how you relate to that now?
I don't know exactly where that would come from. I mean, I was obviously, in a previous podcast, we had talked about how I was a labor union leader and all that sort of thing. So, I came from a background where it was confrontational between labor and management. So, you were fighting all the time to get what you thought you deserved and to, influence things like safety, at the airline industry is where I was. So safety was a big part about what the union did. So, I think, in that environment, there is the tendency for corporate to push you around and to try to tell you, what they think of you and how you're not worth what you think you are. So maybe that plays into why I don't like sort of the pushiness and that sort of thing. But that's all I could really point to, I could think of. I'm not sure where else that might come from. But I agree with you. You're reading right into my personality. I don't like hardcore sales tactics. I don't like, pushiness. That's one of the Yeah, it's also one of the big reasons I haven't been a fan of some of the venture-backed acquisition companies out there that are going around and buying people up, because I think they've been very aggressive in how they've done it. I don't like that. Some of it, though, is just downright, dishonesty. And in a lot of those cases, I think in a lot of high-pressure sales, there is a fundamental dishonesty to it. You're being so high pressure, you're so focused on closing that deal that you will say whatever you need to say to close it. And for me, dishonesty is probably the worst character trait anyone can possibly have. I would rather sit down and talk to an honest murderer than a dishonest run-of-the-mill person, because at least I know that what they're telling me is the truth. I can see who this person really is, and we can have a conversation. If what you're telling me is just BS, then why are we even sitting and having a conversation? It's not even relevant anymore. So, I think that's probably a big part of it too, is there's just a fundamental dishonesty to high pressure stuff.
I could see that. Yeah. I can see that, and I can relate to that. I think in general, people want the truth. People want authenticity. And I experience that as being partly baked into the NARPM circle, if on no other level, then when vendors keep coming back, there is an intrinsic forcing function for the honesty to come out, because people like you talk to other people and it just goes around. You can show up and screw people once, but you can't keep showing up and pulling anything over on people. It's like a self-policing mechanism just to have to look people in the eyeballs every, a couple times a year. That's one of the benefits of the vendor community, but I think a lot of the others have to do is creating some culture in the industry that I'd like to think is probably not the norm in other industries, like knowing your vendors, having fun. We had Thrill the Grill last night. I really enjoyed that. It's laid back, you're kicking it with people, and there is some semblance to the idea that you can actually get to know these people on a personal level, and that what you learn about them personally also informs your understanding of their approach to business and their service offering, et cetera. You can't really divorce the two. You can't divorce corporate culture from your experience as an end consumer. That's my experience.
No, I agree completely. And I think it's kind of weird because this is kind of a big industry in a sense. I mean, there's probably somewhere around 100,000 property managers in America, but, especially at the NARPM level, it's a pretty tight group, I would say. I mean, you generally, if you go to conferences, even just a couple times a year, you generally know a lot of people. You know the vendors, fellow property managers. So like you say, you can't keep screwing people over and over again. People know who you are, word gets around. And I like that about this industry. I was in HOA for a little while. That's not the same. You go to a HOA conference, there is not an openness. People aren't sharing best practices in the same way.
More corporate.
It's very competitive. It's very corporate. It is, it's just not the same. And the same thing on just the real estate sales side. There's always this sense that anybody else I'm talking to is a competitor, and I need to treat them like a competitor. And for whatever reason, and I can't quite pinpoint why, property management is not that way. There's a lot of things I can criticize NARPM for, and I do regularly, but the culture is certainly not one of those things. The openness of sharing best practices. Yeah, definitely. It's been fantastic. So I think we do a much better job of that than other industries do.
I love talking to somebody new when they first show up here, and they're like, have no idea who these vendors are. They have no idea about a lot of the best practices. I'm like, wow, your mind is about to get blown. You're not going to be able to fit all of it in the floppy disk up front, but yeah, the ramp of how much value can be added for somebody to not be a NARPM member and then come in the community, it's insane. And some of that is obviously a credit to NARPM, but also just the community. I mean, NARPM is a collective of individuals that care and are contributing and giving back. And that's a fundamentally human thing. Aside from a name or a label of any organization, that's something that people want to do, is to be known, to be in community, to give back, and it feels good. And I've seen you contribute to that in a number of different ways. I'm curious, when you think about the education and the conversation that is wanted and needed right now, what's a topic, a theme, a best practice, a standard, whatever, that you would like to see get more airtime and would make a big impact for the industry going forward?
Interesting you asked that. At Thrill the Grill last night, I was actually sitting having dinner with Daniel Craig, who's obviously a profit coach that you're involved with. But he's talking about possibly building an operational dashboard. I think that is going to be something revolutionary if that comes about, because we had the NARPM accounting standards, which was, I think, a huge game changer. It really, it got our vocabulary down, all these terms. If you had talked to a property manager 6 years ago and asked what, ARPU they had, it's not even a term. Nobody even knows what the hell you're talking about. Nowadays, we know what that means, and we know what the benchmark for it is. That is a huge shift. I mean, you can't underestimate what that meant for the industry, because you can look at what the numbers were before and what the numbers were after, and you could actually see the difference. I think if you do something like that, if you get people focused on operational KPIs in the same way, that's going to be a similar change in the industry. And we kind of saw that also on the sales side of things with Lead Simple and with RentScale, and then BizDev Mastermind and these other companies that were starting to focus on operationalization of sales, which you talked about for a long time. It kind of did the same thing in that. You know, people started focusing more on KPIs there, on systems and processes. You know, my BDM now at my property management business is probably the best BDM I've ever had. But if you looked at him, you would never think this is like a sales guy. You know, for people who know like Jeremy Pound, who is a natural salesperson, you can look at him and say, well, this is obviously a sales guy. You can see the way he talks, the way his mannerisms are. He's built for sales right out the womb, basically. My BDM is not like that, but I took the playbook that Jeremy built and I handed it to this BDM and I said, hey, you've got the basic personality traits you need to be successful at this. You're not, you know, a rainmaker, but you can do the process. Just follow what's in this book and put it to work. And he did that. And just the operationalizing that, making it systematized, that's all you really need to do to make an enormous difference. So, you know, if we continue to do that in other areas of the business like we've done there, I think that's going to be just an enormous shift.
I think the thought that I'm having right now listening to you is that this is what professionalizing the industry looks like. All of this stuff has truly elevated people, and it's creating more of a delta between property management being done by the seat of your pants as a result of a downturn in the real estate market backwoods versus somebody that is like really dialed, has a framework, a mental model, understands the levels, is graduating, improving what they're doing. I want to see that happen. I want to be able to say with sincerity that professional property management is like a real defensible concept that is worth being paid and commensurate with the value that it's creating. And it's like genuinely exciting to me.
Yeah. And I mean, we've seen that, you know, for people who know, Australia is a lot more that way and it has been for a long time. There are giant companies in Australia that do property management.
Ray White.
Yeah, a perfect example. That's not really a thing yet in the United States. There's some companies starting to get there, like Evernest, Pure. You know, they're starting to get bigger in that sense. But that was never really a thing before. It was always little moms and pops everywhere, kind of doing things their own way. And we're starting to get away from that. And, you know, I think there's good and bad to that, but I think overall it's going to be a lot of good. We just have to make sure that we don't let the good things that we've had, like the sense of community, like the openness, we don't want that to disappear as it becomes more operationalized. We want to keep those good things. So I think that's what we need to focus on as we kind of do this shift, because it is going to become more professional. Like you said, like a multifamily industry, it's going to start to shift more towards that. But we want to make sure we hold on to the good parts of what we've had, I think.
That's such a good place to end. I completely agree. I see the money coming in the industry and I feel generally positive about it, but I am aware I don't want to see the money corrupt things. I don't want to see it exert undue dominance and control in surreptitious ways. And I don't think that that's going to happen. I think there's a possibility for it, but ultimately I think that the good and the light is going to outweigh the bad and the darkness. So
I hope so.
Glad to be in this industry with you, brother. Appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me.
Until next time.
Yep.
That's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. You can check out other episodes along the way. If you're watching this on YouTube, appreciate a subscribe. Any comments, I'm always here to engage. If you're listening on an audio platform, would really appreciate a review. It's a great way to help other people find out about the show.